have the last intervention in the conference, and I have the pleasure and honor to present Professor Jorge Duany. Before doing that, I want to say a couple of things. First, that this is, another landmark in the work that the Puerto Rican Studies Research Working Group is doing here at UMass, and another successful conference. And this is important that we continue the harvest of the seeds that we planted here, because it's important to go beyond having a conference and engaging in different kind of actions, conversations and actions, as Mayaguez just said. So we hope that we can continue the partnership with UConn, Trinity, the region, with the communities, and that we can keep alive the work here at UMass. And having said that, I would like to say that we, as Puerto Ricans, Latino, as activists, as intellectuals, would like to say thank you to Professor Sonia Alvarez, who's being a force for this and many other things that happen in the university. And she will continue with us, but she will not continue in the position that she is, and we will all miss her tremendously for that. Thank you, Sonia. Professor Jorge Duany is the director of the Cuban. I have to give a little bit of a long presentation because Professor Jorge Duany has a lot of accomplishments. And we are actually really happy that he's coming back to this conference. He was here with us last year. And we hope that he will contribute with an article to the book that we're going to edit from the two conferences. Professor Jorge Duany is director now of the Cuban Research Institute and professor of anthropology in the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies at Florida International University. Born in Cuba and raised in Panama and Puerto Rico, but he was a Cuban Rican. Dr. Duany previously served as acting dean of the College of Social Sciences and professor of anthropology at the University of Puerto Rico. He was there for a long time, and it's left a very important mark. He also served as chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and director of the journal Revista de Ciencias Sociales of the UPR. I will have to say that he revived that journal, actually. He has held visiting research and teaching appointments at several U.S. universities, including Harvard, Connecticut, Wisconsin, Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and the University of New York. He earned his PhD in Latin American Studies, specializing in anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm not going to say when. He also holds an MA in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago and a BA in Psychology from Columbia University. Dr. Duany has published extensively on migration, ethnicity, race, nationalism, and transnationalism in Cuba, the Caribbean, and the United States. Really trans-Caribbean scholar. He has also written about Cuban cultural identity on the island and on the diaspora, especially as expressed in literature, music, and religion. He has belonged to the editorial boards of academic journals, such as Cuban Studies, Latino Studies, Centro, Journal of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, Caribbean Studies, Latin American and Caribbean Ethnic Studies, and New West Indian Guide. Dr. Duany is the author, co-author, editor, and co-editor of 20 books, including Puerto Rico, What Everyone Needs to Know. Recently, it's a bestseller. I've seen it in the airports. Un pueblo disperso, dimensiones sociales y culturales de la diáspora cubana. Blurred Borders, Transnational Migration Between the Hispanic Caribbean and the U.S., La Nación en Vaivén, Identidad, Migración y Cultura Popular en Puerto Rico, how the United States racialized Latinos, white hegemony and its consequences, the Puerto Rican nation on the move, identities on the island and the United States, and Cubans in Puerto Rico, ethnic, economy, and cultural identity. Please welcome Professor Jorge Duany.
Thank you, Agustin. I didn't know that the book was available on the airport, but maybe I'll look it up when I go back home. So thanks to the organizers, Agustin, Roberto, and Aurora, for bringing me here back to Amherst. I'm very happy to be back. And I also wanted to acknowledge the presence of 3 former students, Marina Moscoso, Mari Narvaez, and Gabriela Quijano, who's somewhere in the back. So I'm very happy to see you again. It's great to be in the presence of so many colleagues and colleagues and students. So I wish my presentation had been at the beginning rather than the end, because I think Arturo's presentation was very upbeat, and I would like to end on an upbeat note. Unfortunately, much of what I have to say here, just as in last year's conference, I think it's actually even worse, because of course the impact of the hurricane before and after the question of migration has really become much more urgent, and now we're really thinking about how to examine, how to understand what's currently going on in terms of population movement between the island and the mainland. And the first thing I have to say before moving further is that I don't know how many people are going to move from the island to the mainland. That's the question that everyone is asking. Of course, there are estimates. I'm going to review some of those. But everything that we know suggests that it's going to be the largest ever diaspora from Puerto Rico in a country that has already been exporting much of its population for the last 50 years. And there's really nothing that we can compare it to in the island's history, perhaps going back to the Spanish colonial system. So what I'd like to do is then to give you a sense of what recent migration trends look like, both before and after Maria. Most of what I'm going to say, or what I have to say, is really based on pre-Maria data, because we don't really have yet a good sense of how this change in migration patterns is taking place after September 20 of last year. But I do want to go back, and again, we've heard some of these very depressing thoughts about how the economic recession in Puerto Rico, which really began 10 years ago, at least in 2006, is impacting this massive movement of people outside the island. And of course, that has been compounded with the catastrophe, with the so-called unnatural disaster, as this conference has noted. So what are the effects of large-scale migration on Puerto Rico's islands? I think everyone is aware of the fact that Puerto Rico has been losing population at least since 2000, and this is going to increase clearly in this next in the next few months and after Maria. And then finally, I want to review some of these estimates, especially by the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños, which I think are the most serious and reliable. But the range goes from 135,000, which is Centro's more recent and more conservative estimate, all the way to perhaps 400,000 people who are engaged in migration or will engage in migration in the next few months. So that's sort of the plan, and let me see if I can keep your attention after a very long and intense day of discussion. Just to review some of the main issues that have led to where we are at now. Puerto Rico had been growing slowly but surely in the first half of the first decade of the 21st century. There were a couple of years in which there was negative growth, but clearly after 2006, when Section 936 of the IRS code was finally eliminated, we began to see a downward turn in the Puerto Rican economy. There's only 1 year, according to official data, in which there was a very small increase in the economy. But every year after that, and unfortunately, if I had to include projections, it appears economies are not anticipating that the economy will recover in the next decade or so. It really will take more time for the economy to even reach the levels of 2005, which was before the crisis started. I can't go into all the details as to what exactly caused this downturn in the Puerto Rican economy. I will say that it's not technically not a recent phenomenon, especially if you go back to the 1970s. Puerto Rico showed signs of stagnation. The model of Operation Bootstrap, which is based on attracting capital to Puerto Rico and developing manufacturing industries was really exhausted for a long time, but clearly in 2006 the model collapsed, and I think now we are in the process, or the island is in the process of finding ways to create more jobs and sustain economic growth in the future. Population growth, I think, in many ways is a reflection of the state of the very dire state of the economy. I'll take you back to the early 20th century. Puerto Rico had very high levels of population growth, except in the 1950s, of course, when large-scale migration began after World War II. It recovered these relatively high rates of population growth until the year 2000. And then for the first time in the history of Puerto Rico, at least in the modern history as reflected in the census, we saw a small but definitely clear decline, about 2.8% of the population during that census decade. And then in the last 10 years or so, between 2010 and the current period, 2017, we've seen an even larger decline. And mind you, this is before the hurricane. So in 2020, when we'll have new census data, we'll probably see an even larger decline. If you add up all of those 2 decades, we're talking about 12.4% decline, which amounts to about 500,000 people. So Puerto Rico's population reached a high point sometime in the mid-2000s of 3.5, 3.6 million people, and now it's gone down to 3.3 million. And again, everyone expects, especially demographers who do this kind of forecasting, the island's population will reach very quickly a low level of 3 million people in the next few years. And not surprisingly, the Puerto Rican population of Puerto Rico has not been growing, has been declining, as I just noted, since 2000, the census of 2000, and then continued 2010 and so on, while the Puerto Rican population, or I should say the population of Puerto Rican origin in the United States, and of course there's that discussion as to whether real Puerto Ricans or not, and I don't want to go into that discussion right now, but demographically we're talking about several generations of people of Puerto Rican origin, both those born on the island and those born in the US, and this is what you get. You get spectacular growth of the Puerto Rican population in the US, especially since the 1960s and on to the 1970s, and then at some point in the last decade, the number of Puerto Ricans here in the stateside United States has surpassed by a large margin the number of Puerto Ricans on the island. So it's about 2/3 of all Puerto Ricans. If you add up the island and the mainland, 2/3 of all Puerto Ricans now live here in the United States mainland. And again, this is before Hurricane Maria, so everything we know would suggest that this will continue to in the next few months and years. Let me now focus on the more recent period. And again, because we are concentrating our attention on the impact of the economic crisis and population loss, this is a chart showing, well, the first one that comes up here is the number of Puerto Ricans who have resettled in Florida. Again, I don't want to bore you with that same statement, but this is before Maria. And what we see here is a very large proportion of the recent migrants are looking at Florida in particular, and that the share has actually increased since 2005 to the last year, 2017. And then again, the global estimates from the census suggest that beginning in 2005, we've seen a sustained increase from about 50,000 people per year to about 89,000. I think this is the last year in 2017, and this will continue again if you project it into the future. And so probably this year will include more than 100,000 people in the last estimates, perhaps even more. And one of the other long-term patterns that I want to underline is that Puerto Ricans have been moving within the United States in a very definite pattern. So there's been a geographic distribution of the main points, the main destinations of Puerto Ricans. So of course, everyone in this room knows that New York used to be, and still is in many ways, the #1 destination for Puerto Ricans, and has been so for several decades. And in 1970, it was more than 800,000 people, reaching more than 1 million in the last census estimate. The other states that had attracted a large number of Puerto Ricans were, of course, New Jersey, which was number 2 until recently, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and then look at what's happened with Florida. Florida was really an insignificant place for most Puerto Rican migrants until about 1980, 1990, and certainly in the last few decades, and will continue to do so. So if we project this kind of growth of the Puerto Rican population in Florida, it will certainly displace New York as the largest single destination of Puerto Rican with more Puerto Ricans with more than 1 million people. Now I want to make a note here. I know that people in New York don't necessarily like these numbers, and there's been some discussion as to where is the real Puerto Rican community. I don't want to, again, argue with that. New York will remain the #1 Puerto Rican diaspora community for many years, and I'll show you in a moment. New York City in particular, because it's such a large number of Puerto Ricans, more than double the second largest concentration, which is in the Orlando, Kissimmee, and Sanford area. Miami, surprisingly, this is Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach, so it's really South Florida, has become now the #3 destination, and very few people actually talk about it. Chicago, which had been the sort of second city for many ways for Puerto Rican, is now #4, and Philadelphia has remained an important place of concentration for Puerto Ricans, and especially if you include the entire metropolitan area, it is still quite important for recent Puerto Rican migrants. And of course, there are other cities like Boston and Hartford that are increasing their population of Puerto Rican origin in large numbers. Going back to Florida, I want to just focus on a little more specifically on those places in Central and South Florida where Puerto Ricans are now settling. So I mentioned Broward, which is north of Miami-Dade, Osceola, which is close to part of the Orlando metropolitan area, Hillsborough, which is Tampa, and then Orange County, which has really become the mecca for Puerto Ricans in the last few years, and have been so, at least I would say, since the end of the 20th century. This is one way to illustrate that, and I'll show you just quickly the main places where Puerto Ricans have been moving to. Orange, #1, Osceola is #4, and actually 5 of the top 10 destinations of Puerto Rican migrants are now in Florida, particularly in Central Florida, but also again Hillsborough, and Miami-Dade doesn't show up in this particular chart, but it's also important. Palm Beach does in this for this year. And of course, I want to draw your attention to Hampton, Massachusetts, right? Holyoke in particular, which is still a very important point of destination. And for my friends from Hartford, of course, Hartford is still there, or Halford, as people like to say in that city. And then Kings, New York, which is Brooklyn and the Bronx. 20 years ago, we would have said that the largest single concentration of Puerto Ricans were there, but not any longer in terms of the recent migration patterns. I just wanted to include one image of people in Calle, and I want to thank Manuel Frau, who took me to see this wonderful place in Holyoke, and I was really interested in the presentation before on this particular community, and I know there are not only links with Salinas, but also with Calle, because a lot of the early pioneering migrants came from that region, and I understand they tended to work in the tobacco industry. So this is a very interesting phenomenon. I think something that we don't know much about in terms of the more recent pattern of migration. The relocation of Puerto Ricans in smaller, medium cities, not so much. Not only New York City and Orlando and so on, and the big picture, but also these other secondary locations that are important to understand the experience of many recent Puerto Ricans coming to the U.S. So let me just turn my attention now to more qualitative observations about how is this tremendous growth in the Puerto Rican diaspora having an impact, especially on the island, but also here on existing Puerto Rican migrations. And I think the first one, this image to me captures very much of what I want to say, which is the human, the emotional, the family dimensions of the migration experience, particularly when families have to separate and leave family members behind. And of course, that is really the most significant experience for many Puerto Ricans. both before and after Hurricane Maria, that have seen their family lives really disturbed and separated in many ways. So one of the most immediate effects, I think, of this tremendous population movement between Puerto Rico and the US is that, of course, it will be, and it is now already a much smaller population than we could imagine. And of course, I remember when I was growing up in Puerto Rico, our teachers would teach us that Puerto Rico was an overpopulated population, small, no natural resources, and therefore family control was absolutely essential back in the 60s and 70s. Well, be careful what you wish for, because now precisely the fertility rate has declined tremendously. The size of Puerto Rican families is much smaller than 50 years ago, and now we're arguing as to whether this is a good thing for the economy or a bad one. And it turns out that decreasing the size of the population doesn't necessarily improve the living status, the living conditions of those who stay, and especially in the situation after Marina. Demographically, I think the other major consequence of this mass migration from Puerto Rico is that we have been seeing for some years now, and we will continue to see, the increasing aging of the Puerto Rican population. And the aging in this sense refers to the proportion of people who are 65-year-old. And the last number that I remember in Puerto Rico suggested that something about 19% of all people living in Puerto Rico are now more than 65 years old. And furthermore, and this picture captures that trend well, it's going to be primarily a female elderly population. So a lot of abuelitas and a lot of elderly women who are going to live by themselves. They're taking care of children, their grandchildren especially, but of course the needs of this rapidly aging population, I don't think, have been taken care of and have not been addressed sufficiently. And certainly that trend will increase. At the other spectrum, of course, we've already seen before and after the hurricane the closing down of schools. I think somebody mentioned that before. And that has to do both with the aging of the population and also with the fact that there are fewer children entering school. And even we have seen that at the university level for some time now, although universities didn't really prepare for it, that fewer and fewer students were college age and therefore going to go to the University of Puerto Rico and other private universities. So the closing down of schools, the sort of shrinking of the budget for education, as well as the layoff of school teachers, is one disturbing trend that has to do with these other aspects of the Puerto Rican population. The economy, of course, I don't have to go into much detail about this. The fact that economic activity has declined, that manufacturing employment alone has declined by about half in this period, in the last 10 years, and again will probably continue to decrease. And then the ripple effects of the decline or deindustrialization of Puerto Rico in terms of loss of jobs in the government sector, in the construction industry, and almost every other sector that I can imagine. That means that the economy will be smaller and will be more vulnerable unless some other strategies to develop the resources of the island will expand in the near future. Consumer demand has been declining. So many stores, of course, those of you who know places like La Tertulia, the bookstore, you know, but La Tertulia and Piedras, it's one example. Last night we were talking about La Bombonera, and these places that had not only economic significance, but also were important symbolically for a lot of people. And it really is affecting most sectors of the Puerto Rican economy. And the closing down of places like restaurants, hotels, cafeterias, and so on, even pizzeros is on that image, is quite is a topic for concern. Along with the migration of young adults, especially productive adults who were employed, that has meant, and there have been recent estimates of how much money the Puerto Rican government is losing because of the declining tax base. So again, it's sort of a circle, right? Because of economic conditions, people leave, and because they leave, then the economic conditions, at least from a fiscal perspective, decline. There was a mention, I think it was in Marina's presentation earlier, about the issue of how many houses in Puerto Rico are vacant. And the last I saw, I think it was more or less what you mentioned, so something like 20–22% depending on the year and the place. So that's, I mean, 1 out of 5 houses in Puerto Rico are now closed down and vacant. This is a disturbing issue, especially because of the declining value of real estate, and that in part is also related to this process of buying out, right? That these investors are coming into Puerto Rico buying, very nice apartments in Condado and in Verde for a very low price. And from what I know, this trend appears apparently is going to continue. And so, the value, the real estate value is going to plummet in the next few years. So what's remains to be sort of celebrated? I think one trend that I certainly have hopes for is that before the hurricane, and of course now the situation is a little different, but before the hurricane you did see that because of rising prices, because of unemployment, there were many people, especially young people, who were going back to agriculture, to producing their own food, selling it in the market. I think this is from El Placero in Rio Piedras. Unfortunately, as you know, something like 80% of all agricultural crops in Puerto Rico were destroyed by the hurricane, so now there's a slow process of rebuilding this. But I think this is one of those trends that you would hope that would improve the situation, especially for those who want to develop this agricultural sector. And I think I used this particular image in my last presentation here. I'll use it again because I do think, and especially in the context of today's discussion, that the connection between the diaspora and the island is something to celebrate. It's something to look forward to. This is from Orlando, but the same thing could be said for Holyoke and for other parts where Puerto Ricans congregate. Their sense of pride, their sense of connection to the island, their concern with what's going on the island, and that I think is bodes well for the future. So my last remarks are going to be, as I indicated at the beginning, to try to understand in more, in closer detail what is going on since Hurricane Maria. And the first sort of source of information that we could grab before, again, census data and other more serious data are published was this very intriguing set of data that the governor of Florida, his office, has been publishing beginning in October 6th, when airlines resumed their flights to the U.S. And this only includes three places: Orlando, Miami, and Port Everglades. You might remember that a few Puerto Ricans actually were shipped out of the island after the hurricane in one of those cruise ships that sort of gave them that opportunity. So since October 6th to, I think the last date is February 2 or 6, I want to say, you see this tremendous expansion of the number of persons. It's not only Puerto Ricans, it could include female workers, for instance, or people who have gone to Puerto Rico and returned. But certainly the majority of these people, with about 363,000 people, I think was the last estimate, are probably Puerto Ricans. And so, for instance, as I live in Miami, the first news reports that we got were elderly people who needed medical attention. In our campus, we actually received some dialysis patients from Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, small children who were sent to live at least temporarily with relatives so that they wouldn't lose their semesters. Students, we also had about 200 to 300 students from the University of Puerto Rico and other places on the island who came to FIU, people who went to Orlando, and similar to what happened here at UMass, all public universities in Florida extended at least one semester of in-state tuition for Puerto Ricans. I don't know if that's going to be extended further, but clearly it's been one of the attractions of the state. So I wouldn't take these numbers literally. I think they might exaggerate the actual size of the Puerto Rican population going to Florida. And also, of course, we don't know how many of these people went back, or how many came to Massachusetts or New York or other places. So it's a very crude estimate of net migration from Puerto Rico. But still, the numbers I think suggest that we're talking about thousands of people who have relocated to Florida and other places. Another source of information that I want to quickly show you is an Univision online survey, which was conducted very quickly, about a month after the hurricane. And of course, we don't know, who was able to respond to the survey. It was a pretty big sample, and I think it was updated. So the first question that I want to comment on is, a straightforward question. Would you leave Puerto Rico? This is for people who were living on the island. And as you can see, about 2/3 said yes, and about 1/3 said no. We don't know, from that question, we couldn't really estimate how many of them are real migrants or just people who are being displaced for a short period of time and then perhaps thinking of returning. But the second question was, and this is of people who were already living in the US and had come from Puerto Rico since the hurricane, would you return to live in Puerto Rico? Less than half said yes, and the majority, I think it's about 55%, said no. So from this source of information, I think then we can also infer that the decision to move to the United States from Puerto Rico is something quite significant, and that it doesn't look like it's going to be temporary, that most people are actually relocating for good. We did, meaning a professor of political science at my university, Eduardo Gamarra, and myself, we conducted a telephone survey with a small sample of 351 people, but the population was very large, 80,000 telephone numbers, and it was randomly selected. And the telephone poll was conducted early in this year, in 2018. By the way, I don't think I included this now, but I will just tell you before I go into the places. Everyone in that telephone survey said that they were planning to move to the US. And then when we asked them for how long, 65% or so said that more than 5 years. So again, in addition to the Univision survey and the other Florida passenger movement data, we're talking about a sizable movement of people. I wouldn't expect everyone from Puerto Rico to move to the US in the next few months, but clearly it's on people's minds, and it's a very strong incentive. And given the fact that, as you know, six months after the hurricane, still people are without light, many can't really have normal lives, and the question of running water is still an issue, and so forth. So if current conditions continue, I think you should expect to find more and more people actually not only planning but coming to the U.S. Where would they go? According to our survey, Florida would be number one. Let me show you the 5 main destinations by far. Florida, so it's about a third. Then New York, then Texas, then Massachusetts, number 4, and Connecticut. No surprise here, because Puerto Ricans, and like most migrants, tend to go where they find friends and relatives who can help them find jobs and housing and so on. Again, what I think is significant here is that Florida has already surpassed New York, and it will continue to do so. Texas is a little strange in the sense that it doesn't really appear in the top 10 places. Well, actually it does, but not in the top 5. So California appeared with a smaller percentage. So it looks like Puerto Ricans, again, are looking for better job opportunities in different places throughout the U.S. And notice that New Jersey doesn't even appear here in the top 5. Another way to, I don't think you can see that too well, but at least you can see the main patterns. This is from FEMA applications for federal emergency aid by zip code, and of course then again, especially the Florida area and the Orlando metropolitan area are in darker dots there. New York, New Jersey, and the Northeast region again appear as a secondary destination, and then places out in California, Texas, even up northwest, you find a significant number of applications. And again, this doesn't necessarily tell you exactly how many people are moving. It's just the ones that have lost properties or who need to apply for federal emergency aid. In our survey, Professor Gamarra also actually, I wasn't really paying attention to this issue, but he wanted to ask, how do people rate the various responses to Hurricane Maria? And I think that we all agree that it was very poor, and so did the respondents. So I'll show you quickly. The mayors didn't do too well. Most people believe that the response was poor or very poor. Governor Rosselló, more or less the same. FEMA was a little better, but still, you know, a lot of people didn't like the way that FEMA responded. The federal government was not well rated, and of course, President Trump got the worst evaluation from those respondents to our survey. No surprises here, but I think it does confirm something that reporters have been writing about and politicians are probably worried about, which is how Puerto Ricans who are moving to the U.S. going to vote in the next midterm elections and in the presidential elections. And I think this particular cartoon that I took from Facebook says part of the story, although I think it's open to several interpretations, right? Of course, the distance between Washington and the island is one persisting problem. The lack of attention by President Trump and FEMA in particular, of course, he's also holding that thing on his hand. But perhaps it's also related to the topics that we discussed here, the colonial situation, the lack of any kind of urgency to resolve, to address that problem, and perhaps even the idea suggested here from the cartoonist that the problem is President Trump himself. So, and this is one of my final points here, I think everyone expects, this is of course from the last elections with Hillary in Orlando, which she won that area, at least in the Latino population by a large margin. One Latino decisions poll taken right before the elections found that something like 7 or 8 out of 10 Puerto Ricans in that area plan to vote for Hillary. And it's no surprise that Puerto Ricans in the U.S. Nationwide, but also in Florida, tend to favor the Democratic Party. So right now, as we speak, because of the imminent midterm elections this year, I'm sure that many politicians in Central Florida particularly, but also in South Florida, are looking at the impact, the potential impact of the arrival of thousands of Puerto Rican citizens, Puerto Rican immigrants who are U.S. citizens and who therefore can vote. The question in many ways will be precisely that. Of course they are legally entitled to vote, but will they register to vote, and will they actually turn out to vote, and will they vote in large numbers as the caricature and the poll results suggest? If they do, then they might have a strong impact not only on elections in Florida, but of course even nationwide, as Puerto Ricans will be sort of a swing vote within the swing state of the Union. So just to summarize the main points, I want to remind you that even before Maria, there was a long-standing economic recession. In fact, some colleagues have called it a depression because it's been going on for so long and it's been so negative. And this has really shaped the decisions of Puerto Ricans to migrate or not. Maria Olga was asking, what are the things that can make you stay, right? Well, I think in every person's experience, that is the main question. Do I stay? Do I leave? And it's not an easy one, but clearly in the last decade or so, more and more Puerto Ricans have found it necessary to relocate to the United States, just as their fathers and parents and grandparents had done generations before. But again, clearly the numbers that we're seeing now suggest a much bigger and massive migration. That has led in turn to a sustained demographic collapse. I focus on the migration dimension here, but of course there's also the question of fertility rates and lower mortality rates. So demographically speaking, Puerto Rico is now, it looks more like one of the more developed populations of the world in the north, except of course that it doesn't have the kind of economic infrastructure to sustain a much smaller population. And then the socioeconomic conditions, poverty rates, unemployment rates, whichever one you choose, I think the main point here is that living conditions have become less attractive on the island, and particularly after Maria struck. And since then, we've seen a tremendous increase in the number of people who are finding it impossible to stay on the island, and therefore are trying their luck here in the U.S. So my final point, again, perhaps to sort of sound a little more optimistic than many of the data have shown, is that Puerto Rico, both on the island and here in the U.S., is going through a process of reconstruction. It will take some time for the economy to take off. It clearly will not be the same Puerto Rico that I grew up in and that many Puerto Ricans were accustomed to. And I think after Maria, this really is a different country and will be a different country in the next few years. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of our discussion today has been precisely the reaction and the response, the very positive response of Puerto Ricans in the diaspora to help, to organize, to connect, and to contribute in any way they can to the future of the island. Thank you very much.
So we have actually time for engaging Professor Duany and for having like a final dialogue, reflecting about the conference as a whole. So are we going to be passing the... So, the floor is open.
Buenas tardes. Back in the 1970s and 80s in New York City, there was a thing called planned shrinkage. And the idea was that you would let something die and then only reinforce what was good. But it also meant a massive loss of the built environment for Puerto Rican communities in the Bronx, the Philippines, Island, you name it. This is what I saw today is the unplanned shrinkage. Has the same nefarious effects. You close schools, you eliminate social services, you decline the economic activity, and you end up with a big slum. I hate to use the word, but that's it comes out of my mind. One of the things that this conference could be of help, and I thought that I feel very positive, is that the role of the diaspora could be, as I mentioned before, important is that we have a history of fighting back, at least the way I see it from the perspective, and taking over. People are talking about the ocupadores de terreno. Las casitas de Nueva York, it was the same movement. En España se llaman ocupas, con K. So we're not alone in this, unfortunately. But what I'm saying is that the unplanned shrinkage has to be understood that it is going to be shrinkage, except that it's going to go totally crazy. And so I think that this is coming out of the conference. I think that making linkages is important, but really going back to the places that, for better or worse, won some battles in New York, even in Boston, with the Victoria, et cetera. So there are actually case studies where we could actually learn from each other. I found some wonderful stuff about Puerto Rico, which, I mean, I've been out of Puerto Rico for over 50 years, so it's not like I left yesterday. So I just wanted to congratulate, but beyond planned shrinkage, it just kept freaking me out because I was in New York when the city was being burnt down. And you go to the Bronx and it was just horrible in the 70s. But we survived in New York in spite of the planned shrinkage. And yeah, that's my comment.
Great, thank you. So in an attempt to perhaps end on a stand-up, on a more optimistic note, as you said, I wanted to pick up on what you talked about, the possible potential electoral impact of the amount of people who may move from Puerto Rico specifically to Florida. Because, Florida is the state with the third most electoral votes in the country, behind only California and Texas. And, Florida having 29 electoral votes, that's more than both Wisconsin and Michigan combined, right? And Florida went to Trump by only 112,000 votes. So if by what you said, just looking at the 4 months directly after the hurricane, you said there was a conservative estimate about 363,000 people who may have moved. So if only a third of them were to stay and to register to vote, that's more than enough to swing the election. In talking about how that could then, in ways of saying different things so we can think different ways, if there were, is there any talk or perhaps thought about mobilizing the community of Puerto Rican voters within Florida to create a very concrete demand towards the Democratic Party and on the Democratic platform? Something, for example, an amount of debt relief, a pledge to invest in rebuilding Puerto Rico with green energy and a green energy grid, perhaps a pledge for a block grant that would fund the university or fund public education, and a demand that if you give this, we will give you our votes and you will get Florida and perhaps win the election. And if you do not give us this, you will not get our votes. Not that they'll vote for Trump unless they're enamored with paper towels, I don't know, but like maybe that they'll just stay home and protest. Because I feel like with such an isolated population where you can really track that in such an important state, but that's more than enough votes to swing it. And so I think that that might be one of the few moments where Puerto Ricans could feel the impact of their electoral vote more strongly than they have in a number of years. And I'm just wondering if there's any thought towards that.
Hi, thank you for speaking. I have two questions. One, I was speaking with the mayor of Salinas last week, and they were talking about good family flight, where the best families, the entrepreneurs, those with a little extra capital for airfare and to get people settled in the U.S. are leaving devastating communities from a tax base and because there's no more small businesses within the communities and what economic effect I think that has on Puerto Rico and the communities that are coming to in the U.S. And then second, how do you feel that students are driving the immigration because they were missing school and their master's classes and university studies were all delayed, and how do you think that affects the demographics of the people who are living?
This is the last chance that you have, so anybody wants to begin?
I'm going to bring back the issue of Connecticut to the table. I'm going to bring back the issue of Connecticut to the table. I am, again, bringing up the issue of the percentage of Puerto Rican population in Connecticut. Also the fact that in Connecticut, because of that percentage, we may have some leverage. I don't think we have a very organized population, but we may have leverage to make our senators speak on the floor of the Senate on behalf of the people of Puerto Rico. That's one part of the question. The second part of the question is, last year, when you spoke of migration patterns of Puerto Rican people, you spoke not only of departures from Puerto Rico to Florida, but also a very tangled web, some sort of spaghetti graph of back and forth from different cities. And I'm wondering, Florida may seem attractive as an initial point of departure, but maybe flows will depart from Florida, and Florida will not have, looking again on that pattern, may not be as attractive for a longer stay, considering labor markets, and also the fact that since it's part of the south of the United States, racialization processes may not be as attractive, or hospitable for Puerto Rico.
Okay, Luis's comment really have nothing much to add. Is there on? No? Okay, I don't see your, maybe I should stand up. So I agree with Luis's comment about the issue of shrinking, and I think that's going to be the reality for the next years in Puerto Rico. So the question is, how do you manage this shrinking of the economy, of the population, in order to make life more bearable for those who remain? And I agree as well that the example of Puerto Ricans in New York, and Boston, and elsewhere should be one of the points of discussion, so that how Puerto Ricans actually survive that very difficult period of time, which you have studied, particularly with the casitas. So I agree with that observation. The electoral impact in Florida, I think this is the one, aside from the question of how many people are moving, that's the second question the reporters always ask, well, how are they going to vote? And we do know, or we expect Puerto Ricans to lean toward the Democratic Party. However, some polling data suggests that it's not a done deal. That in fact, many Puerto Ricans, including our own polling data from early this year, that many Puerto Ricans from the island don't really affiliate with either one of the major parties. Mostly Democrat, but there's a lot of independents. And of course, on an anecdotal basis, you know that many Puerto Ricans don't really understand, from the island, don't really understand the difference between the two parties. They quickly learn that, right? And they tend to move into the Democratic Party. But I think it's going to be a battleground. It's not really apparent to me that the vast majority of Puerto Ricans, once they settle in Orlando or other places, will vote Democrat. They have to be courted. They have to be convinced that this is the party that they should vote to. Of course, they will vote against Trump. I mean, I think that's pretty clear, especially with the paper towel incident that you mentioned. But it'll be a battleground. The number that I mentioned, 363, I think that's a high estimate. It's not a conservative one. I think the most conservative one is the Centro's estimate of 137, 36. So again, you take off maybe 1/3 of those will vote. So it could be a significant impact, but I'm also wary of predicting that Puerto Ricans will decide the elections, because I've heard that from the last 20 years, and it really didn't happen. It really didn't happen, although clearly, like most Latinos, except for Cuban Americans, Puerto Ricans are one of the most solid voting blocs for the Democratic Party. So I think it's up to the elected officials and the party members to really draw in that vote and again, mobilize it so that they will turn out on election day.
Can I just ask a follow-up quickly? Just because I wanted to reframe that in the sense that I was specifically not asking for a top-down analysis, as in it's up to the party leaders to court the Puerto Rican vote. And I also think that this has little to do with whether they are already Democrats, Republicans, or independents. I mean having a on-the-ground movement where Puerto Ricans, particularly the ones who just left the island, said, this is what we could do for our home. We can demand one thing, green energy or block grant, something for education, some kind of debt relief, and say, as voters, the party who agrees to put this on the platform, the party who agrees to deliver this, is going to be the party we're going to vote for, because we're voting to help the place we just left.
Yeah.
And that way you can cut through whether they have partisan affiliations or not. But again, not waiting for the top to offer that, but is there any kind of organization in Florida who would start a grassroots?
There are a few, right? But I think it's not articulated in such a splendid way as you have just put it. The issue is just to get them out to vote, to register and to vote, and then how they're going to vote and what exactly that will mean in terms of concessions and so on. I think it's not as clear as you put it. There are a couple of questions on the diaspora. I think I heard on the Salinas questions that they're trying to bring in capital and business from the diaspora. Is that what you were referring to?
I was saying that a lot of the well-respected families are the ones that are leaving. The well-respected families are the ones that are leaving, the ones with excess capital for airfare and to get settled. And how does that affect the economics of the cities they've left and the cities they're coming to?
Well, I think I understand two different issues there in your question. One of them is that there has been some discussion as to whether there's a brain drain from Puerto Rico. I don't particularly agree with that phrase, first because people who stay also have brains, and more seriously because those who leave, at least before Maria, were not particularly, were not better educated or were not more skilled than those who stayed. For instance, many more doctors stayed than left, many more engineers and teachers and so on. But the situation now may be different, and we need to see if we can qualify that and understand the situation better. The other thing is that for some time, even before Maria, various administration of Puerto Rican officials have attempted to draw on the diaspora precisely by through attracting them and bring them back so that they would invest, create jobs. That hasn't worked very well. I can't think of, there are a few isolated instances of that happening, but not in any sustained way, so that large numbers of Puerto Ricans with the capital, with the know-how and the education are going back home and investing. And there are a few exceptions, but not a particularly consistent pattern. The students, and we heard, in an excellent panel what U.S. universities are doing. The question there, I think, becomes what will happen after the first semester is over. So this semester, and then will universities continue to attract Puerto Ricans as they did right after the hurricane? And of course, that's a difficult question, because it does mean that fewer students are going to enroll at the University of Puerto Rico. Maybe they won't go back. Same thing for scholars and teachers who find better work opportunities here. So it is a sort of an open question. And clearly, since Hurricane Maria, we have seen a larger displacement of students at all levels, from grade schools all the way to graduate school. And that could have a negative impact on the island's human resources, and again, and the university systems in particular, especially if those who leave are those who are better qualified and who have more opportunities to develop their careers here once they make the move. So Connecticut, yes, I mean, I don't want to correct you on the numbers. I think you're right, that compared to other states like New York and Florida, even though the absolute numbers are smaller, they could certainly have a larger role in state politics than Puerto Ricans in Florida. And by the way, let me just mention that Florida just recently elected its first Puerto Rican senator. And that's grossly underrepresented by, it could improve, and there have been more Puerto Ricans elected at the state level and the county level, but still compared to New York, for instance, or other places, even Connecticut, Puerto Ricans have not been able to achieve proportional representation by any means in political terms. That could be changing in the near future. And then the second part of the question, I think is interesting, because I do remember, I think that the chart that I showed earlier last year was taken from Angelo Falcon's very interesting Atlas of Puerto Rican Migration. It showed arrows in all directions, people coming from the island to the mainland, returning to the island, moving to the west, and so forth. So it's a tangled web. I think it's a good description. However, I think my impression is that even before Hurricane Maria, certainly in the last few months, return migration to Puerto Rico has declined tremendously. For every, if the numbers suggest 89,000 leaving Puerto Rico in the last year that we have estimates for, 20,000 perhaps would have returned. And my expectation would be, and I think we need to have more data on that fewer and fewer people living in the States are now returning. Because again, because of the very difficult conditions that we described before. Whether that will change once living conditions improve, who knows? But for now, I think the arrows are not so complicated. It's really Puerto Ricans to Florida, to New York, a couple of other states, and certainly there's interstate migration, and as people realize that perhaps Orlando is not the magic city. Their idea of Walt Disney World doesn't necessarily correspond, so they look for better opportunities in other places.
Well, thank you. Let's continue the dialogue and begin the conspiracy in the research.